Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the podcast with my guests this time, Mike Israetel and Sam Spinelli. We're going to talk about the SRA curve and how it relates to different systems in the body. But before we do that, I'd love to get an introduction from both of you. Sam, starting from you.
Sure. Sam Spinelli, I'm a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach located in the middle part of British Columbia, Canada. I have a few online businesses, E3 Rehab and Citizen Athletics, and then otherwise just hang out and don't do a lot nowadays.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, like the rest of the world. So Mike Israetel, I'm a co-founder and chief sports scientist at Renaissance Periodization. I'm also a professor of exercise and sports science now at Lehman College, I guess, with Brad Schoenfeld. I write books and read a lot of research and make apps and all that other stuff, and ostensibly train for hypertrophy and jiu-jitsu. So.
All right. So first of all, to establish our discussion, I think that I want to talk about the concept of MRV made famous by, of course, Dr. Mike Israetel, and how it relates to fatigue management. So first of all, what is your MRV, and what do you guys think happens once you train past your MRV for a very prolonged period of time?
Did you want me to start out with that?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So MRV is a theoretical concept, stands for maximum recoverable volume. And it just makes a really, I think, very straightforward assumption that all people who know biology will sort of have to admit to, that biological systems have a finite ability to recover at any given time, though there's a trainable ability. It is finite. And anytime you train, you incur both a stimulus to make adaptations, but also you incur some sort of disruptions that require essentially reconstruction and healing of some sort. And there is a certain volume for any given individual at any given one time doing any given activity, which incurs so much disruption that if you regularly try to continue to train at that volume or above, your ability to recover is going to be just under the demand of the recovery itself. And you will start to accumulate fatigue at a very, very, very fast pace, exponentially, because every single bit of fatigue adds and adds and adds. And all of a sudden, you're not going to be able to recover. And recovery in this sense is meant, in the simplest way possible, a return to normal performance, or in the sense of maybe a bit more on the physical therapy side, a return to sort of baseline tissue structure as it was before. So like, if you have a tendon that's a little frayed and you're doing rehab for it, if you exceed your tendon MRV, your tendon gets more frayed every time you train. That's not a really good thing. And eventually, as a matter of fact, that's how a lot of injuries result anyway, because under the surface, we don't know that that's happening. But in just sport training in general, this is just the theoretical top end that you can possibly train and benefit. Now, as one of my colleagues, Eric Helms, and I have been virulently debating recently, the best sort of training might actually peak even significantly below MRV, but there's no way that the best sort of training peaks above MRV. Like, if you can't recover from the training consistently, there's no way you're gaining from the training outside of short functional overreaching bits for a week at a time. So MRV is great to know theoretically, and it's great, for sport coaches and athletes. It's just great to know that your body has finite limits. It's probably good to know what they are for any given thing that you're doing, so that at best you don't exceed them by a long shot. And that's the worst possible thing you can do, is consistently try to get over MRV, thinking there's some kind of golden rainbow at the end of all that, and just chronically probably running into repeated micro tearing and injury and all that other stuff, and just not having inexplicable no rise in performance.
So Mike, when you talk about MRV currently, do you view the volume aspect of by total number of sets, by sets and weight, or how do you perceive the actual measurement of MRV?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it sort of depends on the context. You can calculate an MRV in any way you want. From any input metrics, you can calculate an MRV as long as some kind of volume is the result. Some ways are more useful than others. So you can calculate an MRV for total tonnage. But one thing that you see there as a slight shortcoming is that intentionally biases down to lower reps. So your total tonnage for sets of 3 or 5 is just not going to be that high because there's just not many reps per set. But your total tonnage for sets of 20 is going to be super high. You're like, oh my God, but there's no way I'm going to be able to recover from this. But each repetition is not as damaging because the forces are so low that it ends up being that for at least hypertrophy training, anywhere between roughly 5 and 30 reps per set tends to cause about the same amount of stimulus and a very similar amount of fatigue. Very generalized point, by the way. And then that way MRV can be shorthand calculated by the number of hard working sets that you do. And the unit time can be a bunch of units of time. It can be per session, it can be per week, it can be per month, it can be per year, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I liked Mike's clarification. I think it's just a common one that makes the MRV, like, as Mike pointed out, it's a theoretical concept. And while I do really like the theoretical aspect of it, I think from like an implementation standpoint, it starts to like become more challenging because when you look at it past an individual level, when you start looking at comparing different individuals or different training styles, it starts to become more challenging to figure out. When you look at something like a person that does Olympic style weightlifting and the amount of volumes that they're producing in snatch, clean and jerks, things like that, where you're generally doing singles or doubles, maybe into triples, the actual from a tonnage standpoint or necessarily repetitions is not going to not be that high. But the amount of fatigue that they might endure from doing that type of training could be quite high in comparison to someone that is maybe doing bodybuilding style training that's accumulating the same tonnage. And so that's just where like the measurement aspect of it becomes so challenging because it is still at this time like mostly theoretical, though I think there's like a ton of aspects that would support it from all of the work that we have in different areas, like looking at the muscle hypertrophy models that we have, looking at the different stimulus adaptation curves, and we have so much biological information that would support that some sort of MRV exists. It's just how do we practically utilize it?
I think that's also quite individual when we talk about one's ability to handle volume, not necessarily at a different training style, but I think that I had a conversation with Ben Esgro and he put it fairly well when he compared it to like something of a tanning salon. If you have someone who's very pale skin, just let him in and burn him into a crisp isn't really going to work. So you have to gradually increase volume to let him sort of adapt to it and be able to handle that in the future. It's not like a set point of thing. All right, so with that in mind, I want to get to the definition of the SRA curve and how it affects tissue, which I'm guessing is sort of similar to the MRV concept. Mike, you want to
Sure.
jump in?
So SRA stands for Stimulus Recovery Adaptation, and that is just essentially like a graphical representation of the time course of the training process. Because the training process, and this was probably, you could call this a pretty big revolution in sport training when it was accepted by most high-level coaches, that you don't actually make gains, so to speak, directly in the training arena or the gym or the gymnastics pit or whatever. You stimulate gains there, and then through a quite interactive process that a lot of times dips into the same resources, you have to both recover from that training and adapt to that training. And that takes some time. It doesn't happen instantly. It takes some hours or some number of days to occur and go through the whole cycle. And then at the end of that cycle, you are adapted, so you made some sorts of gains. And the real big kicker, that sounds like pretty obvious, right? It's like, okay, that makes sense. The big kicker here, and this is where things get a little complex, but worth the discussion and worth thought, is that not all body systems have the same SRA curves. There's not a general training SRA curve. So for example, your technical SRA curve, how quickly you can learn, integrate, and recover from technique training that's not very physically demanding, is on the order of hours. Like you can have 2 productive technique sessions per day and be great. You can do 12 sessions a week like that. You know, tennis players, ping pong players, all kinds of folks like that. They do that all the time. Gymnastics competitors, they train really, really frequently, mostly technically, and it's just great. You would never say, look, you can train technique Monday and we don't want to do the same technique until next Monday. That would be nonsense, right? Because you're very recovered and very adapted. And as a matter of fact, the decay of the technique would start way before then, and you would probably just maintain your abilities and not increase. But there are other subsystems that work on a slightly longer time scale. Hypertrophy SRA curve tends to last a few days. The strength SRA curve, particularly from what components, especially with higher level lifters, the sort of neuropsychological ability to produce very high forces takes some time to recover. And it takes quite a while to recover the stronger you get. And so after squatting 800 for 2 sets of 2, your degree of muscle damage may recover completely within 2 or 3 days. But you don't just go and squat 800 for 2 sets of 2 again then, because there's something is amiss, and some of that is connective tissue related, and some of that is sort of psychoneurological, for lack of a better term. Your brain, for whatever psychological or distinctly neurological reasons, just can't push the pedal again that soon. And so that SRA curve tends to take, depending on the advancement of the lifter, a few days to a week to longer. High-level deadlifters sometimes don't deadlift but for hard once every week and a half or even every 2 weeks. It just doesn't work. They just haven't recovered. And then one of the SRA curves that's particularly interesting, especially from a physical therapy perspective, injury management perspective, is a connective tissue SRA curve. And so your muscles can recover quite rapidly. It takes several days for the actual muscle to recover and heal most of its microtrauma. When you're talking about the muscle fascia, when you're talking about the aponeurosis, when you're talking about the tendon, and when you're talking about bones and ligaments, then your degree of recovery is measured probably not in days, but sometimes in weeks, plural. So for example, what might happen is during a training cycle for Olympic weightlifting, let's say, you are training, and this is how this would sort of play out on training cycle. Say, okay, we have all these SRA curves and they're literally just different timelines. How the hell do we make any sense out of this, right? Because we're necessarily trading one off versus the other. Here's how you would potentially make sense out of it. You would train Olympic weightlifting in the following way. You would train some kind of technical work once to twice a day. Like, because there's lots of technique in Olympic weightlifting. You can do bar turnover, snatch positioning, all this other stuff. And you wouldn't necessarily always train that very hard or with very high volumes, or rather very heavy or with high volumes. So your technical work happens very frequently because the SRA curves drop down and you can train productively again. And if you don't train that often, you're sort of missing out on opportunity cost. During a hypertrophy phase in Olympic weightlifting, you would keep that technique very frequent, 1 to 2 times a day, but your hard hypertrophy work for any particular muscle group might occur 2 to 4 times per week, right? So you would have 2 to 4 hard pushing workouts and pulling workouts and leg workouts and so on and so forth. And then during a strength training phase, you may still train the hypertrophy stuff 2 times a week, but you may train the strength stuff, sets of, heavy sets of 3 to 6 reps for, squats and pulls and presses. You might only train that twice a week for just an example lifter, not 4 times a week, because that would just grind you to a pulp because your nervous system, et cetera, just wouldn't recover on time. So now all of a sudden strength training is a lower time. And it doesn't mean that you only come to the gym during a strength phase twice a week. Or let's say because you have multiple things to get stronger, doesn't even mean you come to the gym 4 or 5 times a week. It means that some of the training is very, very heavy. And later in the PM, you might come back and do light technical training that doesn't interfere with the strength training or anything. It might actually work as active recovery to some extent, but it helps you keep that SRA curve for technique really, really there and in line. And then after that whole process completes itself and you have a competition, shit, we forgot about an SRA curve. It's the connective tissue SRA curve that's the entire time been being depressed, okay? Because stimulus recovery adaptation, during the stimulus, your tissue integrity goes down and your ability to perform goes down, and then it rebounds to a higher level. It's actually been going down that entire time. So you think, oh shit, like I did my competition, but now like my shoulder feels a little funky, my elbow feels not so great. And if you did like a full-on MRI of every organ, every connective tissue in a weightlifter's body after a very productive meet prep, what you would see is that they're like a little bit messed up. Like there's some stuff there that's fine, but it's frayed a little. That's where something like a low volume period of training or an active rest period for 2 to 4 weeks after a really big meet actually allows the recovery and adaptation of the musculotendinous system to occur, and or sorry, of the connective tissues, tendons, ligaments, etc., bones, and then they reach a high point, they're fully recovered, and then you can begin again to go heavy in such a way that degrades them. So knowing that this is the case and knowing that there are multiple systems is really good, because it prevents you from doing dumb stuff, like, for example, not training technique often enough. Another example, training strength as often as you train hypertrophy, which is impossible because your muscles heal faster than your ability to produce force at a high level. Another one is training, assuming that, like, okay, my tendons and connective tissues need to heal every single time 100% before I go hard again. Like, okay, sweet, we'll see you in a week and a half. This is just not going to happen. So you have to be intelligent, make sure the curves align, but also make sure the curves aren't dipping into the negative for an extreme length of time, because you're just buying time at some point, especially with connective tissue stuff, which is why peaking for athletes and a full meet prep for athletes is always a trade-off. It's a fine line. How far can we push all the other systems? Because they just have higher, here's the MRV coming back. Those other systems have higher MRVs. Your MRV for technical training is fucking super high. For hypertrophy, it's a little lower. For strength, it's lower still. For long-term connective tissue integrity, it's lower. So you just need to essentially buy yourself some time, train really, really hard, know that you're doing some damage that's in the short term irreparable to connective tissues, and then have a planned deload or active rest or lower volume to make sure you pull back on that, really recover. And the athletes that really screw themselves over are the ones that do back-to-back hard meets, never taking any time to go easy, lighter and lower volume, and then they get a surprise injury that's a surprise to no one, certainly no one like Sam, who's like, well, I could have told you that was coming. So that's my spiel.
Mm-hmm. I got you. You covered a lot of topics that I was about to talk about. So I want to bring you back to the fact that you said that different bodily systems function differently. So obviously we can't look at the SRA curve for connective tissue in the same way that we do in muscle. But how do we look at it? Where do they intertwine or clash in a way that's counterproductive to our training? And I want to hear Sam talk a bit about some of the stuff that you said.
Yeah, do you want me to answer first, or do you want Sam to go?
No, I want Sam to go first, just to some of his thoughts of what you said.
I think Mike made great points and highlighted a few key aspects there about essentially why we need to plan training across a timeline and not just randomly do things. That was a huge aspect there. And that's one thing that I think a lot of coaches miss out on and probably see more injuries in, is when they don't plan training to be representative of these different body structures and different timelines on their ability to recover. If you, again, have someone who's really strong at deadlifting and they're going to be producing very high amounts, you can't have them do that 3 times a week and then just have them do that for 12 weeks in a row leading into a meet prep. Like, no one should do that. In contrast, we could have a weightlifter train moderately heavy snatching 3 to 4 times a week. And an aspect there is the velocity is not going to allow for these different structures to take as much of an immediate stress. But like Mike had pointed out, the different body structures will still accumulate different challenges that they don't necessarily recover as easily with in the short time frame, something like connective tissue. And that's where we could have a relatively similar amount of challenge to a muscular system or a nervous system across that timeline for these different types of training systems. But then in contrast, when we come to the meet, they're going to need to have that time to now recover and adapt these other structures that we kind of, in a way, degraded during that. And that's one thing that, like Mike again pointed out, was you see people that have frequent competitions, frequent peaks where they go and they try to do that. And it is those individuals that we do tend to see have a lot more injuries. And that's an aspect that needs to be considered, is what point do you start to get to such a ability to express strength or express power and technical proficiency that you can exert such a high level of stimulus that you need to now start to recover and adapt better. That's one thing where if you're a novice in any of these kinds of different sports, whether it be powerlifting or weightlifting, CrossFit, any of this, you could compete more frequently. It's not necessarily a big deal because you're not creating such a stimulus that you inherently need to recover as much. In contrast, as you get to it's hard to dictate exactly what a high level is, but if you are someone that is reaching your upper levels of what your maximum genetic capacity is, that's where we're going to need to start planning this out more appropriately. So in the case of, if you are a coach that only works with primarily novices, you probably never had to really worry about it. But as you start to work with these people who are at the highest levels and trying to change, world records, personal records to the highest degrees, that's where we need to start having this greater degree of planning and context. So I don't know if there's anything else you really want from that.
If I can say something real quick, I think a lot of the guys at the top, they're already wise to the idea that they can't always push it super hard because these different subsystems don't heal at the same rate. But my kind of the folks that I have the most trepidation working with is genetically gifted upper intermediates that want a shot at the title. And you're like, hey, active rest. And they're like, fuck that. And you're like, I might be able to squeeze some toothpaste out of you and get you to where you want to go, or you'll break in half. I just don't want to be the coach that breaks you in half. And the unfortunate thing, and maybe Sam and Igor, you can weigh in on how one would deal with this as a coach psychologically, there's always a coach out there who is willing to squeeze their tube of toothpaste out for them. And sometimes, because of the survivability bias, these coaches have like a track record of great athletes that they've coached and world records that they've coached. And they also have like a track record of producing like, here's completely like defunct people with 5 broken things. But once you don't hear about a person, you don't hear about a person. A person doesn't post like, and a lot of people don't even make the connection. They're like, well, coach, what's his name? Got me hurt and 50 other people. Like, well, if you have a world record and you also have some injuries, a lot of people are like, well, it just comes with the territory. So it's always tough to hold back because the advanced level guys, usually they know because they've been through injuries before and they're like, that was stupid. I'm not doing that again. But the upper intermediates that really want it, and they don't want to believe that the curves are starting to really behave differently for them. They're like, I feel fine. I feel recovered. And they know they're not, but they really think a lot of it's mental. Like you just got to keep pushing. And I've always had trouble broaching that. I don't know how you guys, if you guys want to talk about how you would even begin that conversation.
I think that the Bulgarian method is a good example of what you just said, where you just push it, and you never hear about the hundreds of guys that just got injured off it. And about what you said, I wanted to ask you about athletes who are right in the middle, where they just start out competing and their coaches are pushing them to compete more and more frequently, and obviously they peak them to each competition. Do you think that it would be a smarter approach from a coach to consider maybe not peaking him to some competitions and taking that L, so to speak, just so they can gain that experience while still keeping recovery at a high priority?
So 2 factors. One is, where's the athlete going? What's their potential and what do they want? If you just want to be like a badass weekend warrior, fucking peak away. If you have like Olympic dreams or national level dreams, or you just want to be the best weightlifter you can possibly be in the appropriate amount of time, which you know is not going to be in your first 3 years of training, then the correct answer is the coach should be holding you back. Not in training, but for peaking in competition and making sure you get plenty of active rest, taking care of you, long-term investment. And I think the best solution to that, so to speak, is to just try to talk some sense into the athlete and really convince them that you're on their side. Like, explain this to them. I think it's good to sit athletes down and be like, look, can we gas you up and just go for broke? Of course we can. Do you think you're among the first 1 million people to have that idea? They're like, no, I guess not. Okay. Everyone thinks that's a good idea. The problem is, do you want to be a great weightlifter in 5 years, or someone who's been pretty good and is too injured to continue in 3? And they're like, and sometimes when they're young and impressionable, like we all used to be, they might need to think about that. True champions don't need to think about that. They're like, no. Olympics 2024, that's what I want. Okay, great. So we're going to take a 2-week active rest. And they're going to be like, okay, it's part of the plan. It's part of the plan. And you also, it's good to have a culture as a coach, and a culture at your gym, if you're coaching out of a gym, of the long-term plan, the long-term plan, the long-term plan. Like, we're scheming over here. This isn't like a crack bank robbery where like the teller drops $100 and you reach for it. This is like mastermind jewel heist type shit where you're like, we know exactly where everyone's moving. We know the door code for the secretary and that kind of stuff. It takes months to pull off. Clearly I used to be a bank robber, if you guys can't tell. But And Sam and I used to actually work together on bank robberies. We were the terrible British Columbia terror, they used to call us. We were ruthless, but we planned everything, right? So it's all like, Sam's like, I don't know, there's nothing, is this live? So basically, it's a culture of planning and approach. Like one of my very good friends, Max Ada, who's a weightlifting coach. Like if you're going to be coached by Max, you know there's a plan. And since he's coached so many good people, he doesn't have any shortage of clients. If you're like, no, I want to push it now, he's going to be like, see ya. You just won't have a coach, and you'll just go to someone else. And he doesn't care because he knows the process and he takes care of his athletes long term. Not every coach is like that. So as an athlete, you might want to find a coach like that. And unfortunately, just the last thing I'll say is sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes an athlete doesn't want to buy in long term, and they go to another coach, and then they become great without you. But the question isn't, could I have caught every single athlete and done the best job possible? No, it's looking forward, am I doing the best job possible? Because you also want to do right by your athletes. The last thing I would want to be as a coach is looking from the warm-up room and watch an athlete lose a quad tendon on the platform on their way to greatness in the qualifier meet and know that it was my pushing them as far as they wanted to be pushed that had a contribution. I would feel so terrible. I think they just ruined a guy's Olympic career because I wasn't willing to be patient. And if you as a coach aren't willing to be patient, holy crap, how's the athlete supposed to do it?
Yeah, I think Mike made great points there. And when we're not robbing banks, a big aspect is having these kind of conversations with these athletes. And Mike pointed out two major things of where's the athlete going to be in the long term, and then also like what is the plan for those individual meets. And then I think another aspect to consider is how proficient is the athlete with competing on a stage. Are they someone that gets extremely nervous and is not going to be able to have a good competition because they're not very well versed at actually stepping onto a stage, versus someone who is just game no matter what and is going to go out and you don't have any concern. Whatever you put on the bar, they're going to destroy. And for some individuals, they just need to gain that experience where you're going to technically like not peak them in training, but you are going to let them go out and have a legitimately challenging meet, even though they maybe shouldn't from a general standpoint in training, because they still have to learn how to get comfortable pushing on the platform and get comfortable actually putting out in front of a crowd and in front of judges. My wife is an example where she's a high level weightlifter and she gets extremely nervous in front of competitions. She can go and break almost every record in Canada in the gym, but then when you put her in front of a moderately sized crowd, she gets extremely nervous and doesn't perform very well. And then over time, now she's done a lot more meets and now she holds lots of records. But the aspect that took that change was her coach, who's not me, encouraged her to go and do more frequent meets and get comfortable competing in front of people. And he let her go and do whatever she wanted to do, essentially from a standpoint of numbers. It was just like, you're going to compete 4 to 5 times a year, which is more than I would normally want, but I just want you to show up and get the best outcome you can, and we'll just see where it takes you across time. And then once she got more proficient and comfortable with actually reaching substantial numbers on the stage, now it stepped back, and now we're going to scale and pick which meets we're going to push you harder on. And that's the part where is, again, deciding where they are from a mentality standpoint, and then scaling which meets you're going to have. And as Mike pointed out, is like being able to have that conversation. And if an athlete isn't going to be able to jive with you long term, you might have to let them go. And I think that is a problem that a lot of younger coaches really struggle with. I know I was once there where I wanted to just please every athlete and make whatever I could happen. And
Yes,
sometimes I would maybe make poor decisions, but it was like, I want to see this person be a happy athlete. And
especially when you get a freak, right? You get a genetic freak and you think like, this is my ticket to me being a good coach. Like, this is the guy that's going to go to nationals and put me on the map. I'm not going to stop him, but you maybe think.
No, exactly. And that's that is a thing that takes time from a coaching standpoint of being able to get comfortable saying that to athletes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you guys think that there should be a more methodical system in place to try to manage connective tissue SRA curves to your training program other than just planned deloads, since we don't really feel our degradation in the connective tissues that well? Is there something, a way to manage it other than just planned deloads?
I think the longer term form of a deload, which is an active rest phase, is critical. And the harder the sport is intensity wise, the longer and more frequent they need to be. So like bodybuilding's just not that hard. It messes you up from a lot of volume, but there's not a lot of trauma going on. So, you know, once a year or 2 weeks of active rest is more than enough for most people. At a higher level, you need more. We take it a sport at the other end of the spectrum, MMA. After every fight, it's 2 to 4 weeks of active rest because you just got literally beat up and there's stuff really, really messed up. And there's, you know, everything in between. So for weightlifting, I think it's, you know, 2 to 3 weeks of active rest, 1 to 2 times a year, depending on how good the athlete is and really how much absolute weight they're lifting. And that actually correlates to weight class too. A really small weight class person just doesn't really do much damage and they heal faster relatively. So 1 to 2 weeks every couple of months for them is totally fine. But if you have a super heavy who's, you know, front squats 350 or something, gee whiz, you know, they're going to need 3 or 4 weeks at least once a year to really heal everything up. And another one is there's something you can do in these phases to heal up connective tissues, but you also need to get understanding of all of your other MRVs so that you regularly don't push the connective tissues too far and you find ways around various lifts that might irritate things a ton. Like if someone has no problem pulling from the floor, they're super strong pulling from the floor, but when they pull from the floor, their lower back is a huge limiting factor and they start to get sciatica or they start to get SI pain. There's just some pulling that just can't be done from the floor. And then you might put them on blocks. And then from just 5 centimeter blocks, they're pulling all day, all night, no problem. Maybe that's an adjustment you have to make. And someone could be like, so why doesn't he pull from the floor as much? And you're like, well, we would if we could, but there's some trade-off of stimulus to fatigue we're just not willing to make. Some guys can overhead press until the cows come home and their shoulders are fine. Some people can't overhead press as much, so they might need to do some high incline barbell pressing. They might need to do more push pressing because push pressing sometimes is ironically more gentle on the shoulders than overhead pressing. Maybe they need to come down in a more dynamic fashion versus slow eccentric lowering, which can really fuck up your shoulders if you're just not lucky. So a lot of times those little adjustments need to be made, and awareness of the athlete's chronic condition. Like if an athlete keeps telling you like my knees are hurting, they're hurting more now, they're hurting more, and you're like, whatever, active rest is coming in like 5 months, you'll be fine. Then maybe you're doing a disservice, and there may be some other ways around that sort of thing. So first, do as little harm as you have to get the results you want. Be aware of how much you can do and get away with temporarily, and also make sure to diligently plan active rest, active recovery, and make sure that they actually do it. The making sure they actually do it part's tough because some athletes will sneak into the weight room and hit maxes all the time.
Yeah, I think all those points are exactly what you need to do. Most of the stuff that you're going to be doing due diligence on is from a programming standpoint and coaching standpoint. Anything past that, once you start getting into all these random modalities and other accessory treatments, they don't necessarily have any substantial benefit, and it's just going to be a waste of time and wasted money for the athlete. So yeah, focus on appropriate planning, appropriate coaching, appropriate load management, crush it.
Mm-hmm. And do you guys think that different rep schemes have different outcomes as far as the reaction of connective tissue to them? Meaning, I can tolerate a couple of sets of 12s in comparison to if I just go hard on sets of 3 for a long period of time on heavy back squats. My knees are probably going to get hurt at some point when doing heavy sets of 3s. Is that something that you would consider to be a deload of sort, just to plan out higher rep ranges to manage load?
I would think that it's actually more related to either A, effort level, or B, velocity. Higher levels, I think that the most ends of the spectrum, so either extremely high velocities or extremely low velocities, are going to be more the ones that we typically are going to see connective tissue challenges, in contrast to, moderately paced back squat. You probably won't have too extreme of an issue, whereas if you're having a grinding out back squat or an extremely fast back squat, and that's why we probably also see it in other sports, these ones that have very high velocities, more of the connective tissue damages, versus something like bodybuilding where you tend to be at a more relatively paced tempo.
I think that deloading while still trying to train hard in some capacity is probably fundamentally a bad idea. The most critical element to deloading is how much disruption you're providing. And deloading requires an absolute reduction in disruption so that your recovery abilities can catch up to your accumulated fatigue and clear it. So it's like saying, switching, let's say you're doing lots of triples hard and your knees start to hurt. Taking a deload where you do hard sets of 12, like sets of 12 close to failure, is similar to being like, I'm really exhausted from work this week. I'm going to take my kids to the amusement park and run around with fucking roller coasters and clowns. I hate clowns to begin with. I'm going to walk like 30,000 steps and lose my children 3 times and yell at them and call the park police, and they get my children back. And everyone needs snacks and everyone needs junk food after. And then I collapse and get 5 hours of sleep. Like, yeah, it's different and it's fun, but it's not rest. It's just not. So if you're really tired, and that's how people say, like, when do you go out on the weekends? Is when you had a week that wasn't super too difficult. Like, it was tough. Maybe you accomplished some things, you're proud of yourself. But when you have a week that really crushes you, that's when you stay in and watch Netflix all weekend. Like, that's what it's for. Deloading sets of 12 absolutely will hurt your knees less, but they'll hurt your muscles more. And then your total amount of accumulated fatigue, which includes sort of neuroendocrine factors like hormonal disruption, they'll stay elevated. So you'll feel like shit at the next week, just a different kind of shit. And what you want with deloading, and this is quoting some folks in the research of actual overreaching protocols, Andy Fry particularly from Kansas, and his direct quote is, when you hit the brakes, hit them hard. Like, when you're deloading, it should be very easy. It's just not a time to go hard. And I think a lot of people, the way they're tempted to switch to higher reps when they're deloading is because they still want some kind of challenge. The purpose, the background of deloading is not challenge. It is to not have a challenge. So I think that, yeah, sets of 12, to answer your question directly, will be easier on your knees, but they'll be harder on other stuff. And what we want is a net reduction in difficulty. Sam, what do you think about it? Am I on the right track?
No, exactly. Yeah, I didn't address that part of Viker's question. So yeah, I think that the general principle is, for most people, just stick with the standard plan that you were doing, but then make it a lot easier. Push those brakes. It's not just change it to a different stimulus and then start training hard again. That's kind of like takes away the purpose of the deload. It's now a time to allow recovery so that you can adapt and start a new training block, not just start a new training block. And that's the part that a lot of people begin to struggle with. And I think from a coaching standpoint is expressing that. That's one thing that I've experienced, is where I have a lot of athletes that either A, have come from having no deloads, or have come from a background of where they deload in maybe not an intelligent way, and explaining what the exact purpose is and why I want them to go in and have easy training.
And they'll complain too at the beginning, right? Because they'll be like, this is too easy. Like, that's the point.
Yeah. But then when you come back and you have a killer training block, then it's like, okay, now this makes sense. And that can be something that's really hard for some athletes initially. But once they start to come back into training, they feel good and they feel fresh and they're ready to actually go and hit the gym again, it usually starts to make sense for them.
100%.
Now, I wanted to clarify, since I think that I asked the question in the wrong way. I didn't mean that the switch should come instead of a deload, but more to sort of delay the deload, maybe in the form of introductory blocks that are slightly easier, but not exactly deloading, just to keep training adaptation going. And I wanted to mention an article that Sam wrote for Stronger by Science a couple of years ago about lumbar flexion, where they've talked about, there was one study that was talking about not necessarily load that was causing injury, but more the exposure to the same stimulus being, I think, just pressure on a flexed spinal position. So I wanted to ask if, I'm assuming that Mike knows what 30 reps of squats are feel like, or yeah. But I guess it sucks enough that your technique will degrade over time, and obviously that's not something that we would be looking forward to. So I kind of want to hear your thoughts about that myth that high volume equals sort of low stress on the joints, hence it's much less injurious of an activity. Sam?
So to clarify, the question is, lower reps are easier on joints than higher reps are. Is that right?
Not exactly, but more that more exposures to a certain movement would be more of a risk factor rather than just heavier weight and less exposures, meaning less volume or just less total reps.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the general standpoint of actual risk, then we can find risk is elevated by either a change in relative intensity, total intensity, and also total repetitions into it. So the thing is that it's a risk. It's how much does it change, and the end of the conversation is that the risk of these various things does increase with greater exposure. How much it increases is a very different conversation and highly specific to each of the different types of structures we talk about, different positions we talk about. But in general, like if we're talking about going into a lumbar flex position during a back squat, either with more repetitions or with more load, generally it increases the risk. The degree of risk is usually way overstated. It's not necessarily that high, and it's highly individual. And yeah, it's a tricky one to nail down. I don't know to what degree you want me to expand on it.
Whatever you see fit. Mike, do you have anything to say about that?
Sure. So I think if we look at the literature across sporting disciplines and the different types of movements, we tend to see that injury risk, as actually Sam noted earlier very wisely, injury risk is highest when we have very high maximum forces or very high maximum velocities, especially velocities in conjunction with dynamic changes of direction. Like if someone's doing boing, 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 they're going to get hurt. And the higher the displacement from the ground, the more often the injuries happen and the more severe. The most dangerous sport in the world is cheerleading because they throw people not under their own propulsion, but under other human propulsion, like basket tosses. You miss one of those shits, you're like done. Like gymnastics is pretty dangerous because they go really high. Basketball actually way more dangerous than anything like lifting weights because you leave the ground. So in that, those are just really high velocities and of course impact forces when you come down. Then you go to things like strongman or Highland games, which you don't leave the ground as much, but the implements are very awkward and a lot of dynamism, a lot of moving back and forth and very high forces. The next less risky thing is weightlifting, where you do have some very high forces, not the highest, but you have a lot of dynamic movements, catching and things like that, and really fast change of direction. The next safest activity is powerlifting, which has very, very high forces, but under incredibly similar conditions and a very, very well-grooved patterns of motion. There's just not much room for error. And the total volume of training isn't that high. So as Sam said, the total amount of exposure and risk is just not that, it's just not doing as much. And then the least injurious thing you can do in the gym, outside of like, I'm sure like aqua aerobics or something, is like, love to see who gets hurt in aqua aerobics. Can you imagine that? Like, I pulled my pec. You're like, what? We're in a swimming pool. So you're like, that's just like,
I know a guy that was injured in aqua aerobics.
Oh my God. It's just like not cut out for sport. You know what I mean? He's like, can I do Olympic
That guy's got to
weightlifting?
hang up the Speedo.
No. Seriously, or whatever you're wearing at that point.
I think he's going to hear that. So
oh boy. Well,
he's going to take the advice.
Listen, who knows, right? So, and then so the least injurious of the strength sports is bodybuilding, because it has very predictable paths, because the average forces are very, very low, and because there's almost, especially if you're training it more correctly than not, there's not a lot of dynamism. There's not a lot of rapid change of direction, thus the velocity and force at the same time, because dynamic movements have both high forces and high velocity at the same time, which really, if you really want to get hurt, combining high force and velocity is like, oh, that's it, in unpredictable patterns that you're not used to. Car accident, okay? Yeah, so that's how to get hurt. And so bodybuilding has least of that. Yes, it has, the more volume you do in bodybuilding, the more your injury risk goes up because the more exposure hours you have. But generally speaking, the trade-off is worth it from less high velocity and less high force and more contact hours. Bodybuilding is still on average safer. But as I think Sam again very intelligently pointed out, if you really want to deload and if you really want to reduce your risk, the total exposure time, the total volume, the total number of reps you do, it matters. So people say like, well, you know, I don't want to squat heavy. I'm going to squat lighter to really just eliminate injury risk to the back. Well, you know, every rep you do has a smaller injury risk, but you're doing 12 of them shits. And if you do a single, it has a bigger injury risk, but it's just a single. So there's ways if you do lots of volume to even become more injured in probability than if you do high load stuff. On average, with most training methods, the higher loads do cause slightly higher injuries than higher volumes. But especially if you're one of these people, this is the worst possible way to do it. Is as a power lifter who's already exposed to high loads, telling yourself, you know, I'm going to deload with just high volumes. And then you're just getting another way of bad stuff, not recovering from anything. And then you're really at a disadvantage. I think a lot of people try to get away from the idea that to really heal the body for another good productive block of training, you need to just do less. And they're trying to get away from it at every possible pill I can take. Is there ice therapy? And there's no way around it. You just have to sit down more or take more walks with your dog and do less clean and jerks. And that's really the only way about it, I think.
No, I think that was excellent. And Mike, you pointed out great points there. And at the end of the day, it's going to be, how much are you willing to pull back to then be able to go into the next block and have it as productive as possible? And one of the challenges I think for many athletes is that they still want to feel like they're doing something and being productive. And that's one of the challenges usually for them is like the perception that it's not being productive. And for, at least in my experience, being able to utilize more technical based training during a deload at a very light load or more mental based training can be something very valuable during those deload periods to let them feel at least like they're doing something that they would otherwise not be.
That's a great idea because the technical stuff is not injurious. It's already a deload in every capacity, but it lets them really feel like they're doing something, and not just feel, they are doing something. And it's actually a net benefit because you can really clean up technique during a deload. And that's when you could put so little weight on the bar that there's no ego involved, and you can actually clean up technique even better because they're willing to be like, okay, I'll use, 30 kilos and really try to work on this positioning, where normally during normal training, there's not even a context for that because they just want to warm up to the real weights. I will say something really quick though. I think I like to say this. I think it makes some sense, and I've used it with athletes before to some level of success, but it's been a long time since I've coached athletes directly. When people push the pedal a bit too much, when athletes push the pedal a bit too much on, I want to feel good in training, I want to feel like I'm doing something, I just bring up the Russians and the Chinese and all the other people better than Canada and the United States and Israel at weightlifting. And say, you think these motherfuckers feel anything? Do you think when they tell their coach, I feel, the coach is even, do you think the coach even listens to what they're saying? That these people are machines. They do what has to be done to win. It doesn't matter how the fuck they feel. Can you imagine what a Chinese coach would do to a weightlifter if they caught them like training off hours because they felt like doing more? I don't even know if Chinese have civil rights, but who knows what happens? A person turns into soap or some shit like that. They just like, what happened to Lu Yan, the last year's champion? They're like, oh, we don't talk about him anymore. You're like, oh, son, okay, he was great. He just came into the gym too many times. So like, the thing is, if you want to compete on the level of these machines from all these other countries that they're doing what it takes. They're not children. They're like, I want to do this. I feel like doing that. Look, if you're training a psychotherapy, welcome to recreational fitness. That's why all the rest of us go to gyms. If you want to do training to become the best, you got to do what it takes. And that means pushing hard when you don't want and resting when you also don't want. It means you do the plan as it's written with, of course, intelligent autoregulation and feedback. But at some point, you're going to have to do some things you don't feel like doing and if you ever doubt that, just think, what are the Russians and Chinese doing right now? They're doing machine shit, and they're going to come to the Olympics and they're fuck you up because they're machines. But if you start being a machine too, you got a fighting chance. But can you imagine, like, you pull your last snatch of the day at like Worlds, and then the Chinese guy opens with his snatch 5 kilos above you, and you're like, fuck. And then you think like, well, at least I had fun in training last year. Like, really? Like, you flew to Tokyo to have, like, really? Was that what it's all about? So I don't know if you guys have any input on that or if that's just crazy. I don't know.
No, exactly. That's a great way of explaining to a lot of athletes. It's like this is a different conversation if you are trying to be something with this. If you're just going to the gym because you want to go to the gym and exercise, cool, hang loose, go find a way. Like, You're also probably not training at such a sufficiently high level on a regular basis that you necessarily need to have such a diligently
Yeah, but it doesn't even
planned
matter.
deload. Yeah. Whereas like if you are pushing to the highest levels and truly reaching your genetic potential, you're going to need to do this, and it's going to have to be something that you take way more seriously. And that's one of the things that for a lot of you mentioned before, the people that are like middle group but on the higher end of the spectrum, usually like some genetic freak individuals, those are the ones that usually have to have that conversation, because it's like you legitimately have the potential where you could do this, but you're just not willing to actually follow an appropriate plan. And for a lot of those people, it's like, I'm sorry that you're tired, but this is the time where you need to push. I'm sorry that now you're excited and want to keep going, but now you need to pull back. And being a good coach is going to be able to, being a good coach is going to require you to actually have that conversation with them. And it
Yep.
can't just be, yeah.
And that Chinese guy, you just remind him, the Chinese guy across the sea, he also has really good genetics. He's also a freak, except he does what he's supposed to. What do you think about that? You know, like it's easy to get away with stuff when you're gifted in a small pond. When you get in a big ocean of giftedness, you're not the only person that's gifted anymore. Now it's got time to really think about what you want to do in the sport versus just like following your emotion.
Mm-hmm. And I think this goes well with the saying that anything that you can do, there is a Chinese 8-year-old that can do it better than you. All right, and with this part of the conversation, I think I'm going to use these as closing thoughts, as I see that we're coming up to the 1 hour mark. So do you guys want to say anything about upcoming projects, or where might people find you on social media or anything like that?
Thanks for letting us come on, by the way. This has been a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Sam, it's been really great to discuss this with you because you're super smart and you know what you're doing. A lot of times I'm in debates against people who maybe just don't know that much or as much, and then all of a sudden I'm like saying shit that to them sounds crazy, but I'm like, why don't you know this? But yeah, I'm on Instagram, RP Dr. Mike, Renaissance Periodization at RP Strength. And then if folks are really interested in higher level insight about powerlifting, load management, weightlifting, stuff like that, I would actually recommend Juggernaut Training Systems on YouTube and on Instagram, Chad Wesley Smith stuff, and they have a huge website. And there's just access to just countless hours of videos and all kinds of stuff about how to make a hypertrophy plan, how to make a strength plan, and all this other stuff. And then you can find myself on YouTube. It's Renaissance Periodization on YouTube. We put up tons of videos, mostly hypertrophy stuff nowadays, but tons of strength stuff as well. And that's good shit. But the last thing I will say is hire a coach, especially in weightlifting and powerlifting, someone who knows what they're doing. We have plenty of great coaches at Renaissance Periodization. Christian Carter comes to mind, Donna Swisher, but somebody like Sam, somebody like, Quinn Hannock or something like that, Max Zeta, it's just, there's people out there that know stuff. You don't have to be making these mistakes doing the shit on your own. So give that some thought. Yeah,
I don't know if you know this part, but I'm being coached by Sam. So, well, with the whole pandemic thing, a bit less, but
you got a great coach.
You can find, thank you very much, Mike, and I appreciate the recommendation. For anyone that wants to find more about me, you can find me at Dr. Sam Spinelli on Instagram. You can find my two businesses on there, Assistant Athletics 1 on Instagram, Assistant Athletics on YouTube, E3 Rehab on Instagram and YouTube. And then, I actually support that recommendation a lot. Juggernaut Training Systems has tons of great content for anyone that wants to be involved in weightlifting or powerlifting. Mike has some great presentations on there as well on their YouTube channel. And can't say enough. Thanks for having us, Iger.
Okay, thank you guys for coming on, and I'm hoping to have another discussion sometime.
Very cool. Thanks so much.
Cool.
Have a nice day.